I had built my company with my hands before my son was old enough to hold a wrench. 37 years of early mornings and late invoices, of payroll met by the skin of my teeth in the lean years, of watching a fleet of 4 trucks grow into something I was genuinely proud of. When my son brought Claire home for the first time and she shook my hand with that smile that never quite reached her eyes, I made a decision right there in my kitchen doorway. I would not volunteer a single word about what I owned. That decision saved everything. My son, Nathan, is a good man. I want to be clear about that, because this story could make him sound weak, and he isn't. He's just the kind of person who trusts the people he loves, and sometimes that trust gets aimed in the wrong direction. He was 31 when he met Claire at a conference in Phoenix. She worked in corporate acquisitions, something involving mergers, due diligence, finding undervalued assets, and restructuring them for profit. She was sharp, well-dressed, and knew exactly how to make a man feel like the most interesting person in the room. She had been dating Nathan for 4 months when she first came to Sunday dinner. I had made pot roast, my late wife's recipe, the one that takes most of the day. My daughter-in-law, Nathan's older sister, Ellen, had driven up from Columbus and was already at the kitchen table when Nathan and Claire walked through the door. I noticed Claire pause in the entryway, not to take off her coat or set down her purse. She paused to look at the house, at the furniture, at the framed photos on the wall. She was doing an appraisal before she'd even said hello. Dinner was pleasant enough on the surface. Claire was charming when she wanted to be. She asked about the neighborhood, about Ellen's kids, about how long I'd lived there. Then, somewhere between the salad and the main course, she leaned slightly forward and said she'd love to hear about my work. I told her I was in logistics, which was true. I left it at that. She smiled and tilted her head and said that sounded interesting. What did that mean exactly? I said it meant I helped move things from one place to another, and then I asked her how she liked the Midwest winters compared to Phoenix. Ellen caught my eye across the table. She knew what I was doing. Ellen had always been the sharper of my 2 kids. She spotted Claire within the first 20 minutes, the same way a dog smells a storm coming. She said nothing, just reached for the breadbasket and kept the conversation moving. After dinner, Nathan helped me in the kitchen while Claire and Ellen sat in the living room. My son was glowing in that particular way young men do when they've fallen hard for someone. He dried dishes and talked about Claire's career, her intelligence, how she saw opportunities everywhere. I nodded and said she seemed driven. He said she was the most focused person he'd ever met. I handed him another plate and said nothing more. They got engaged 11 months later. I flew to Phoenix for the proposal dinner and watched my son put a ring on Claire's finger at a restaurant that charged $40 for a salad. Claire cried, which surprised me, and I decided in that moment I might be wrong about her. People contain more than first impressions. I hoped I was wrong. The wedding was in September, in a vineyard outside of Asheville. Beautiful venue. Nathan looked like the happiest man alive. I gave a toast that made half the room cry, and I meant every word of it. Whatever I thought about Claire, I loved my son, and that day belonged to him. The honeymoon was 2 weeks in Italy. When they came back, Claire and Nathan sat down with me for what Nathan called a family check-in. They had driven to my house on a Tuesday evening, which struck me as deliberate. Not a casual visit, a scheduled conversation. We sat in the living room and Nathan said, with a kind of careful tone that meant someone else had coached the words, that they were thinking about their future, about stability, about what the next 10 years looked like. I said that sounded sensible. Claire had a small notebook on the coffee table, not open, just sitting there. A prop, I realized, a signal that this was a structured conversation. She said that Nathan had mentioned my business was doing well, and that as family, she hoped we could be open with each other about financial planning, long-term stuff. She said she worked with family-owned businesses all the time in her career, and she knew how these things could get complicated if there wasn't a clear plan. I looked at my son. Nathan had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable. I told Claire that I had a business attorney and a financial advisor who handled all of that, and that I appreciated her concern, and then I offered them coffee. She accepted the coffee. She didn't ask again that night, but she had planted a flag, and we both knew it. Over the next several months, The questions came in different shapes. Some arrived through Nathan, as gentle suggestions. Had I thought about bringing on a partner? Was I planning to retire soon? Had I considered what a sale might look like if the right offer came along? Some came directly from Claire in the form of casual observations. She'd mention articles she'd read about family, business succession, or offhand comments about how hard it must be to manage everything alone at my age. I was 63. I want you to understand what 63 actually looks like from the inside. It means I wake up at 5:15 without an alarm. It means I have read every contract my company has signed in the last decade. It means I know my drivers by name, know their kids' names, know which ones are going through divorces and which ones just bought houses. I was not a fragile old man waiting to be relieved of a burden. I had built something that worked, and I went to work every morning because I chose to. But Claire didn't see any of that. She saw an aging man with an asset she hadn't yet quantified. That winter, she asked me directly if she could look at the company financials. She framed it as wanting to help. She said she could identify inefficiencies, maybe find ways to reduce overhead, that she did this for a living and it would cost me nothing. She said it with a warm smile, her hand briefly touching my arm. I told her I'd think about it. What I actually did was call my attorney the next morning. My attorney's name is Dennis. I've worked with him for 22 years. He's thorough, cautious, and has never once given me bad advice. I told him about Claire's background, about the pattern of questions, about what my gut was telling me. Dennis listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then said he thought we should revisit the company structure we had set up after my wife passed. My wife, Patricia, died 8 years ago from a condition that came on fast and took her in 4 months. Before she got sick, we had spent an evening with Dennis going through what would happen to everything if something happened to one of us or both of us. Patricia had insisted on it. She was always more organized than me, more planful. We put the company inside a trust. Patricia was a co-trustee while she was alive. When she died, I became the sole trustee, with Ellen named as successor trustee. Nathan was a trust beneficiary, as were any children he might have, but the operational control of the company, the actual authority to make decisions about it, sat entirely with the trustee, meaning me. And after me, Ellen, not Nathan's spouse, not Claire. Dennis and I updated a few things, nothing dramatic, just tightened some language, made sure everything was current. When I left his office, I felt the particular calm that comes from knowing the foundation under your feet is solid. I said nothing to Nathan or Claire about any of this. Spring came. Nathan and Claire bought a house 20 minutes from mine, which I was genuinely glad about. I wanted to see my son. I wanted to be the kind of father who showed up with groceries and stayed for dinner, who fixed the stuck door in the guest room and knew where the spare key was. I worked at having a normal relationship with them, even as I maintained the one boundary that mattered. The boundary broke in June. Claire had apparently been doing her own research. She worked in acquisitions. She knew how to find things. She had gotten enough information about my company to understand roughly what it was worth. I found this out later, after the fact. At the time, all I knew was that Nathan called me on a Thursday evening, sounding strained, and asked if he could bring Claire by Saturday morning because there was something they needed to discuss. I said of course. I also called Ellen. My daughter drove 4 hours on Friday and was at my kitchen table when Nathan and Claire arrived Saturday at 10 o'clock. Claire did not expect Ellen to be there. I saw it in the quarter-second adjustment she made before her expression settled back into neutral. Nathan hugged his sister. Claire hugged her. Everyone sat down. What followed was the most precisely constructed conversation I had experienced in 63 years of dealing with people. Claire had clearly prepared for this. She started with the market, said she'd been following trends in mid-sized logistics companies, said consolidation was happening industry-wide, said the window for a strong sale was narrowing. She had numbers. Not my numbers, she didn't have access to those, but industry comparables, valuation ranges, what a company of my approximate size and age might fetch. She suggested, with a voice full of gentle concern, that I consider a sale while conditions were favorable. She said the proceeds would take care of me comfortably for the rest of my life. She said she had contacts, real buyers, serious money. She could make introductions. I watched my son during this speech. He was looking at the table. When Claire finished, Ellen spoke before I could. She asked Claire, very pleasantly, who exactly these buyers were and what their interest in the company would be post-acquisition. Claire said the details would depend on negotiation. Ellen asked whether there was already a specific offer on the table. Claire said not yet, but she was confident. Ellen nodded slowly and said that was helpful context. Then I spoke. I said I wasn't planning to sell. I said I appreciated Claire's knowledge of the market and that I understood she was trying to be helpful, but that this company was not something I was looking to exit. I said I'd been running it for 37 years and planned to keep running it. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and I remember this precisely, "Dad, at some point, you'll need to think about what's fair to Nathan." The word fair landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Nathan looked up from the table. His jaw was tight. I kept my voice even. I said my son had never wanted for anything, and that what happened with the business in the long run was a matter I handled through proper legal and financial planning, not a Saturday morning kitchen conversation. Claire opened her mouth. Ellen cleared her throat softly, which was enough. They left an hour later. Nathan hugged me at the door and held on a half-second longer than usual. He didn't say anything. I watched their car back down the driveway. Ellen stood beside me. She said that woman was not going to stop. I told her I knew. I was right. August brought a letter. It came to my house, not my office, which told me Claire had found my home address specifically, had used it deliberately. The letter was from an attorney I didn't recognize, a firm out of Charlotte. It was professionally worded and made my blood run cold for about 40 seconds, which is how long it took me to read it a second time and understand that it had no actual legal standing. The letter suggested, in careful language, that as a spouse of a potential heir, Claire had an interest in understanding the company's structure for estate planning purposes and requested documentation. It was a fishing expedition dressed in legal stationery. I called Dennis that afternoon. He sent a response within 48 hours that was brief, accurate, and closed every door the Charlotte letter had nudged open. Then I called Nathan. I did not tell my son about the letter at first. I asked him to have dinner with me, just the two of us. He came on a Wednesday, and we went to a steakhouse we'd been going to since he was in high school. I ordered a bourbon, and he ordered a beer, and we talked about his job. He worked in supply chain management for a manufacturer, separate from my business entirely, and about the house, about a trip he wanted to take. Then I asked him how things were at home. He was quiet for a moment. He turned his beer glass slowly on the table. He said things were fine, mostly. He said Claire was under stress with a deal she was working on. I said that I had received a letter from an attorney representing his wife, asking for documentation about my company. Nathan's hand went still on the glass. I kept my tone calm. I said I wasn't angry. I said I wanted him to know what was happening. I passed him a copy of the letter across the table, and I watched him read it. I watched the color change in his face. Not the color of embarrassment, something deeper. The color of a man who has just understood something he should have understood earlier. He asked me if I had known this was coming. I said I'd had a feeling for a while. He put the letter down. He said he hadn't known about this. His voice was flat and careful, the voice of a person working very hard to stay controlled. I believed him. I knew my son. He had not written that letter. He had not hired that attorney, but he had brought Claire into our lives, and he had repeated enough of our private conversations to give her the materials she needed. And I think he understood that at the table without me having to say it. We finished dinner mostly in silence. When we said goodbye in the parking lot, he said he was sorry. Just those 3 words. I told him he didn't need to apologize to me. I said what mattered was that he paid attention now. He nodded. He got in his car. He sat there for a moment before he started the engine. What happened next came 3 weeks later. Claire arrived at my house on a Tuesday afternoon. I had not been told she was coming. She was alone, which was unusual. She was dressed as though she had come from a meeting blazer, portfolio under her arm. She rang the doorbell like a business appointment. I let her in. She sat at my kitchen table, and she laid out what I can only describe as a presentation. She had printed materials. She had a timeline. She had, at the bottom of her portfolio, a document that she slid across the table to me, a proposed management transition agreement with signature lines at the bottom. She had brought a notary. The notary was waiting in her car. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt, didn't react, just listened to the entire thing. She was good at this. She was genuinely skilled at constructing an argument, at making a hostile maneuver sound like rational planning. She talked about my age. She talked about the strain of running a company. She talked about family legacy and protecting Nathan's future. When she was done, I stood up, walked to my desk in the corner of the kitchen, and pulled out a folder. I sat back down. I placed the folder on the table and opened it slowly. Inside was a summary document Dennis had prepared, plain language, no jargon. It explained that the company was held by a family trust established in 2016. It explained that the trustee me held sole operational authority. It explained that no transfer of company assets, control, or management rights could occur without the trustee's written consent and the involvement of the successor trustee. It explained that a spouse of a beneficiary carried no standing under the trust structure to demand, request, or receive documentation. I slid it across to her. Claire picked it up. She read it once, quickly. Then she read it again, slowly. I watched her face. She was a professional, and professionals have trained expressions, but there is a particular moment when understanding overrides training. I saw it happen. The slight tension above her eyebrows. The stillness of a person who has just realized that the room they walked into has no exits. She set the document down. She asked how long the trust had been set up. I told her 8 years. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if Nathan knew about this structure. I said that Nathan was a beneficiary of the trust and that the details had always been available to him if he'd asked. She said he had never mentioned it. I said no. I supposed he hadn't. She gathered her materials with great care, the practiced calm of someone who has absorbed a serious loss and is refusing to let it show. She thanked me for my time. She walked to the door and put on her coat and said she hoped there were no hard feelings. I told her I wished her well. I meant it, sincerely, because I had already won and I could afford to be gracious. She left. The notary in the car waited another 10 minutes before the car finally pulled away. I stood at the kitchen window and watched it go and thought about Patricia, about sitting with Dennis all those years ago and making the decisions that turned out to matter this much. The months that followed were not easy. Nathan and Claire hit a wall of some kind. I didn't ask questions, and he didn't offer details, but something shifted in them, or at least in him. He called me more. He came by on his own, on Sunday afternoons, the way he used to before he got married. He'd sit in the kitchen with coffee and we'd talk about whatever was in front of us. He never brought up Claire's visit to my house. I never brought it up either. Then one Sunday in December he came by and sat down, and after a while he said he needed to tell me something. He said he had been thinking about a lot of things. He said he had gone back through conversations he'd had with Claire over the past 2 years, and he had started to understand the shape of them differently than he had at the time. He said he thought he had been used as a source of information without fully realizing it. He wasn't wrong. I didn't confirm or expand on this. I just said that people show us who they are in stages, and that recognizing something, even late, was still recognizing it. He stared at his coffee for a long time. He told me that Claire had admitted, during an argument, that she had begun planning the business approach before they were even married. She had looked me up, researched the industry, run estimates. She had known what she was walking toward before she'd walked through my door the first time. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once, and each time his voice was a little rawer. I told him what was true, that none of this was his fault at its root. He had loved someone who had a different agenda. That happened to people. The measure of a person wasn't whether they got deceived. It was what they did once they understood the situation. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He said he didn't know what came next. I said he didn't have to know yet. I said he could just sit here with his coffee and figure it out in time. He nodded. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine for a moment, the way his mother used to do when something was too heavy for words. Outside, the first snow of the season had started coming down, slow and quiet. Nathan filed for divorce in February. He moved back into his old bedroom for 6 weeks while things were sorted out. Claire had a separate attorney, not the Charlotte firm, and the process was difficult, but it moved. She was not going to get anything from my company. She knew that, and her attorney knew that. And once that was established, the rest was just paperwork. I went to work every morning at 6:45, the same as I had for 37 years. My dispatcher waved at me from across the yard. My drivers checked in for their routes. The phones rang with jobs, estimates, renewals. Everything my wife and I had built was still standing. One morning in March, I was at my desk reviewing contracts when Nathan appeared in the doorway of my office. He had started working with me temporarily while he figured out his next step, not running things, just helping, learning the parts of the business he'd never paid attention to before. He stood in the doorway looking at the framed photo on my wall, a picture of the first truck we ever owned, a second-hand box truck with a dent in the rear bumper that I never got fixed. He asked when I'd gotten it. I told him the year. I told him his mother had come with me to pick it up, that she'd climbed into the passenger seat and rolled down the window and said this was the beginning. He was quiet for a moment. He said he never knew that story. I told him I had a lot of stories he didn't know yet. He looked at me. He said maybe he should start listening more carefully. I told him that was the best plan I'd heard in years. He went back to his desk. I picked up my coffee and looked out the window at the yard, at the fleet that now numbered 31 vehicles, at the company that bore a name I had chosen because it was the first word that had come to me. Not a family name, not something clever, just a word that meant solid and enduring. I had not talked about what I owned when my son got married. I had not explained the trust, or the legal structure, or the years of careful, patient planning that went into making sure the right things were protected. I had just kept quiet and let time do what time does when the foundation is solid. A man I'd met at a Chamber of Commerce dinner years ago had told me once that the best protection you can build isn't a wall, it's a structure. Your enemies don't know exists until they walk straight into it. I thought about that a lot in the months after Claire left. I thought about it one afternoon in April when Nathan and I drove to look at a warehouse property that had come up for sale. It was a long shot, probably not right for us, but worth seeing. We drove down a county road with the windows down and the radio on low, and my son asked questions I hadn't heard him ask before. Smart questions, operational questions, the kind that meant he had actually been paying attention. I answered every one of them. I had been waiting, without fully knowing it, for this. By the time we pulled into the property, he was already telling me what he'd noticed from the road, what looked good, what needed work. I turned off the engine. I sat for a second and looked at my son, his hands on his knees, his eyes on the building, alert and thinking, and I thought that whatever the last 2 years had cost, this was the other side of it. Whatever had been tried had not succeeded. What had always been ours remained ours. We got out of the truck and walked toward the building together in the afternoon light, and neither of us needed to say anything about any of it. Some things are just understood.